The moment a person decides your worth by the color of your skin, they reveal far more about themselves than they ever will about you. The breakfast rush had barely begun when the bell above the front door chimed softly, letting another customer step into Rosie's diner, a place where the coffee was always hot, the pancakes were always fresh, and strangers often left feeling a little less alone than when they arrived. Outside, a crisp autumn breeze swept across Main Street in the quiet town of Asheford, Virginia, carrying golden leaves along the sidewalk as the morning sun reflected against parked pickup trucks and family sedans. Inside, the warm glow of hanging lights settled gently over polished wooden tables while country music drifted quietly from an old jukebox tucked beside the pie display. At the corner booth nearest the window sat a man who looked completely ordinary. He wore a charcoal gray suit without a tie, a neatly folded navy pocket square, and a simple silver watch that had clearly seen years of use. His reading glasses rested beside a cup of black coffee, while an untouched plate of scrambled eggs cooled slowly in front of him. Senator Elijah Brooks preferred mornings exactly like this. No cameras, no speeches, no security detail hovering over his shoulder. Just a quiet meal before another long day of meetings at the state capitol. Few people recognized him without the television lights or the marble halls of government surrounding him. That anonymity was something he valued more than most people understood. Grace Collins, the diner's owner, smiled warmly as she walked by carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Need a refill, Mr. Brooks?" she asked. Elijah returned the smile with the same quiet kindness that had earned him respect long before he ever won an election. "Only if you promise not to charge me extra this time," he joked. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "You've been trying that joke for 5 years, Senator. It still isn't working." Around them, families chatted over waffles, construction workers discussed the day's projects, and a retired couple argued playfully about baseball scores from the night before. It felt like the kind of ordinary American morning that people rarely noticed until it disappeared. Then the diner door opened again. This time the cheerful bell sounded strangely louder. Officer Daniel Mercer stepped inside wearing a neatly pressed uniform, his polished badge catching the sunlight for just a second before he removed his sunglasses. Several customers greeted him politely. He answered with a brief nod, scanning the room almost automatically. His eyes moved from table to table until they stopped. They settled on Elijah Brooks. The warmth seemed to leave his expression almost instantly. He stared for several seconds without speaking, his jaw tightening as though he had already reached a conclusion no one else could understand. Elijah looked up calmly from the newspaper resting beside his coffee. Their eyes met for only a moment before the senator offered the same polite smile he would have given any stranger. Mercer did not return it. Instead, he walked directly toward the booth with measured steps that caused nearby conversations to fade one by one. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Coffee cups stopped in midair. Grace noticed the sudden silence before she even saw where the officer was heading. Elijah remained seated, composed, folding the newspaper carefully and placing it beside his plate. There was no fear on his face, only quiet curiosity. Officer Mercer stopped beside the booth and looked down at him without introducing himself. His voice carried across the diner with enough volume that nearly everyone could hear. "Stand up, sir," he said firmly. "I need to ask you a few questions." The room seemed to hold its breath. Elijah Brooks slowly placed both hands on the edge of the table before rising from the booth with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades refusing to let difficult moments define him. He offered a courteous nod that carried neither fear nor defiance. "Good morning, officer," he said evenly. "How may I help you today?" Daniel Mercer did not acknowledge the greeting. Instead, his sharp eyes moved across Elijah's suit, the leather briefcase resting beside the booth, and the untouched breakfast that was growing cold. "Identification," Mercer said. "I want to see it now." The entire diner had fallen unusually quiet. Even the waitress who had been pouring coffee into a customer's mug stopped halfway through the motion as everyone sensed that something about the exchange did not feel right. Elijah reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Of course," he replied. "I am happy to cooperate." Before his wallet was fully visible, Mercer lifted one hand. "Easy," he said in a firmer voice. "Keep your movements where I can see them." Elijah immediately paused. "Certainly." His expression remained composed, almost gentle, as though he understood that reacting emotionally would accomplish nothing. Grace Collins hurried toward them, drying her hands with a kitchen towel. "Officer Mercer," she said politely, "there must be some misunderstanding. Mr. Brooks has breakfast here almost every Tuesday." Mercer barely glanced in her direction. "Ma'am, I am conducting official police business. Please step back." Grace hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "But he has been coming here for years." "I said step back." His tone remained controlled, yet it carried enough authority to make several customers exchange uneasy looks. Elijah finally removed his driver's license and held it where Mercer could see it without taking another step. "Here you are." Mercer accepted the card without saying thank you. His eyes examined it for only a brief moment before lifting back toward Elijah. Something in his expression suggested that the identification had not changed his mind at all. "Stay where you are," he instructed. Elijah nodded once. "I have no intention of leaving." Near the front counter, a young mother quietly reached for her phone. Across the room, one of the construction workers whispered to his friend, "This does not make any sense." The older man sitting near the window lowered his newspaper and watched silently, concern spreading across his face. Grace folded her arms tightly across her apron. She had known Elijah Brooks for nearly 6 years. He always greeted the staff by name, always left a generous tip, and never spoke down to anyone regardless of their position. Watching him stand alone under growing suspicion felt deeply unsettling. Mercer continued asking questions. "What brings you to Asheford this morning?" "Breakfast before my meetings." "Meetings with whom?" "Several community leaders." "Where exactly?" Elijah answered each question patiently, never raising his voice or showing irritation. Every response was clear, respectful, and measured. Yet Mercer seemed to interpret the calmness as something suspicious rather than reassuring. The officer took another slow step closer. "You expect me to believe you are just passing through?" Elijah met his eyes without anger. "You do not have to believe me, officer. The facts will speak for themselves." Those words lingered in the air for a moment. Several customers noticed that Mercer frowned even more deeply, almost as though the quiet confidence offended him. At that exact moment, the diner door opened once again, and a professionally dressed woman carrying a tablet computer hurried inside. She scanned the room anxiously until her eyes landed on Elijah. The color drained from her face as she realized everyone was staring at the senator. The woman froze for only a fraction of a second before walking briskly across the diner, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and urgency. Naomi Carter had worked beside Senator Elijah Brooks for nearly 8 years, long enough to recognize when silence was more powerful than argument. But the scene unfolding before her made even that discipline difficult to maintain. "Senator Brooks," she said carefully, stopping several feet away, "the committee chair just called. They are expecting us in Richmond by 11. Elijah offered the slightest nod, almost as though they were discussing nothing more serious than a delayed appointment. "Thank you, Naomi. It appears we have encountered an unexpected interruption." Officer Daniel Mercer immediately shifted his attention toward her. "And who are you?" Naomi reached into her handbag with deliberate, unhurried movements. "My name is Naomi Carter. I serve as Senator Brooks's legislative director." She produced an official identification badge issued by the state government and held it where Mercer could examine it. Several customers leaned forward, expecting the uncomfortable misunderstanding to end. Mercer glanced briefly at the badge before looking back at Elijah. "Anybody can carry an identification card," he said flatly. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Officer, this is a state-issued credential. That does not answer my questions." Grace Collins stepped forward again, unable to remain silent. "Officer Mercer, you know me. You know this diner. Mr. Brooks has been eating breakfast here for years. He has hosted charity events for this town. Half the people in this room recognize him." Mercer remained unmoved. "Recognition is not proof." The older gentleman near the window slowly stood from his table. "Young man," he said calmly, "I voted for Senator Brooks twice." "That is him." Another voice followed from the counter. "So did I." Then another. "My church worked with his education program." One by one, ordinary people quietly confirmed the same truth. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply honest. Yet the growing chorus only seemed to harden Mercer's posture. "Everyone needs to stay out of this," he announced. "Interfering with a police investigation is not helping anyone." Elijah listened without interrupting. His shoulders remained relaxed, and his breathing never changed. Naomi looked at him with visible concern. "Senator, perhaps I should contact Capitol Security." Elijah answered softly enough that only those closest could hear. "Not yet. But this has gone too far. Truth does not become stronger because we become louder." Those words settled over the room like a quiet reminder that dignity could survive even the most uncomfortable moments. Mercer folded his arms. "What exactly is your business in Asheford?" Elijah answered exactly as he had before, meeting local business owners and community volunteers before returning to Richmond. "Can anyone verify that?" Naomi almost laughed in disbelief. "Officer, there are 200 people waiting for him this afternoon." Mercer ignored her completely. Outside the diner windows, a black sedan slowly rolled past before continuing down the street. None of the customers paid much attention, but Naomi noticed it immediately. She glanced toward her watch, then toward Elijah, realizing that the schedule they had followed with military precision for years was already beginning to unravel. Quietly, she stepped a few feet away and unlocked her phone beneath the edge of the counter. Grace noticed the movement, but said nothing. Naomi hesitated for only a heartbeat before selecting a contact she rarely needed to call directly. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she pressed the button. As the phone rang, she looked back across the diner at Senator Brooks, who still stood calmly beside the booth where his breakfast had long since gone cold, surrounded by strangers whose growing silence had become far louder than any argument ever could. Naomi held the phone against her ear, speaking quietly enough that only a few words escaped into the stillness surrounding her. "Yes, it is happening now. Asheford, Rosie's diner." She listened for several seconds before ending the call with a simple, "Thank you." She slipped the phone back into her handbag and looked toward Elijah. He met her eyes only briefly before giving the smallest nod, a silent reminder that patience often accomplished what anger never could. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed the exchange immediately. "Who were you calling?" he demanded. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Someone who deserves to know what is taking place." Mercer frowned. "That is not your decision to make." "Perhaps not," Naomi replied evenly. "But transparency is always the right decision." Grace Collins quietly walked behind the counter and turned off the coffee grinder that had begun humming automatically. The sudden silence made the atmosphere inside the diner feel even heavier. Every chair remained occupied, yet no one seemed interested in finishing breakfast anymore. Parents quietly pulled children a little closer. A truck driver removed his baseball cap. Even the country music playing from the old jukebox seemed strangely distant beneath the weight of uncertainty. Elijah continued standing beside his booth with remarkable composure. His coffee had gone completely cold, and the morning newspaper remained folded exactly where he had left it. Looking at him, it was almost impossible to believe he had become the center of such uncomfortable attention. Mercer stepped closer once again. "Turn around," he instructed. Elijah did not argue. "Officer," he said calmly, "I have cooperated with every request you have made this morning. May I ask why this situation continues to escalate?" "Because I determine when my investigation is complete." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Authority carries responsibility as well." Mercer ignored the comment. "Turn around." A long silence settled over the room. Grace looked away, unable to hide the sadness spreading across her face. Naomi instinctively took one small step forward before stopping herself. She knew Elijah well enough to recognize that he did not want anyone creating further conflict. Slowly, Elijah turned exactly as instructed. Several customers exchanged uneasy glances. A young college student standing near the entrance quietly lowered her phone after recording nearly everything that had happened since Mercer first approached the booth. No one cheered. No one protested loudly. The only sounds came from the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional clink of silverware against forgotten plates. Mercer removed a pair of handcuffs from his duty belt. The metallic sound echoed through the diner with surprising clarity. Grace covered her mouth with one hand. "Officer, please," she whispered. "This is not necessary." Mercer did not respond. Elijah remained perfectly still, offering no resistance whatsoever. His voice stayed calm. "I trust that whatever happens today will eventually be judged by the truth." Mercer secured the handcuffs without another word. Several customers lowered their heads. Others simply stared in disbelief. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment before taking a slow breath. The humiliation filling the room was impossible to ignore, yet Elijah's quiet dignity somehow refused to disappear beneath it. He stood exactly as he had only minutes earlier, shoulders relaxed, posture steady, treating every person around him with the same respect he had shown since walking through the diner doors. One elderly woman quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. "He does not deserve this," she whispered to her husband. The man nodded silently. Outside, a few pedestrians slowed as they noticed people gathering near the diner windows. Inside, no one seemed interested in speaking anymore. Then, breaking through the silence, a familiar ringtone echoed sharply from Officer Mercer's uniform pocket. He glanced at the screen. His expression remained confident at first, but the moment he read the caller identification, something changed. The certainty that had defined every decision he made that morning gave way to the slightest hint of hesitation as the words displayed across the screen read simply, "Governor Michael Whitmore." Officer Daniel Mercer stared at the phone for several long seconds, as though the name on the screen had to be a mistake. Around him, the diner remained perfectly still. Every customer seemed to understand that something important had just changed, even if none of them yet knew why. Mercer finally answered. "Officer Mercer speaking." His confident tone lasted only until the voice on the other end replied. "This is Governor Michael Whitmore." The officer straightened instinctively. "Yes, Governor." The room was so quiet that several nearby customers could hear only Mercer's side of the conversation, but even that was enough to reveal the growing tension. "Yes, sir." A pause. "He is here." Another pause, noticeably longer this time. Mercer's eyes slowly drifted toward Elijah Brooks, whose calm expression had not changed despite the handcuffs resting around his wrists. I was responding to what I believed was suspicious activity." Silence followed as the governor continued speaking. Mercer's shoulders lost some of their rigid confidence. "No, sir. I did not contact Capitol Security." Another pause. "No, sir." Grace Collins watched as the color gradually faded from the officer's face. Naomi Carter remained motionless, though she quietly released a breath she had been holding for what felt like several minutes. Elijah simply waited. He neither celebrated nor appeared angry. His attention rested on Mercer with quiet compassion, almost as though he understood exactly how quickly a single decision could change the course of a person's life. Mercer swallowed before speaking again. "Yes, Governor. I understand." His voice sounded noticeably softer now. "Immediately, sir." The call ended. The phone remained in his hand for another moment before he slowly lowered it. No one inside the diner spoke. Even the children sensed that something significant had happened. Mercer looked toward Elijah, then toward the customers surrounding them. For the first time that morning, uncertainty replaced certainty. Grace finally broke the silence. "Officer," she asked gently. Mercer hesitated. His hands remained still at his sides while the weight of the governor's words settled over him. Naomi stepped forward carefully, her voice respectful but steady. "Would you like me to explain who Senator Brooks is now?" Mercer closed his eyes briefly. "That will not be necessary." The admission seemed to echo through the room more loudly than any raised voice could have. He slowly reached toward the handcuffs, pausing before speaking directly to Elijah for the first time as one person to another rather than as an authority figure giving commands. "Senator Brooks." The words seemed difficult to say. Elijah waited patiently. "Yes, officer." Mercer looked down for a moment before meeting the senator's eyes. "I have been informed of your identity." Elijah answered with the same calm dignity that had guided him from the beginning. "Identity is important, officer. But every citizen deserves fairness before their identity is known." Those words settled over the diner like the final piece of a lesson no one present would ever forget. Several customers quietly nodded. Others lowered their eyes, reflecting on everything they had witnessed. Outside, another black sedan pulled into the parking lot, followed moments later by two official state vehicles whose arrival drew the attention of everyone near the windows. The morning that had begun with nothing more than coffee and conversation was about to become something no one in Asheford would ever forget. The front door opened, allowing the cool autumn air to drift into the diner as two dark state vehicles came to a smooth stop outside. Their arrival immediately drew every eye toward the windows. No emergency lights flashed. No sirens sounded. Everything about their approach reflected quiet authority rather than spectacle. The first person to enter was a middle-aged man in a navy suit wearing a small state security lapel pin. Behind him came another official carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the seal of the governor's office. The room remained silent as both men walked directly towards Senator Elijah Brooks. Neither appeared surprised to find him standing calmly beside the booth. The senior official offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, Senator Brooks. Governor Whitmore sends his apologies for the delay." Elijah returned the gesture with his usual warmth. "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate you making the drive." Thomas briefly looked toward the handcuffs before turning to Officer Daniel Mercer. His voice remained professional. "Officer, I am Thomas Reynolds, Executive Director of Protective Operations for the Governor's Office. We have been instructed to assist immediately." Mercer swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Thomas reached into his jacket and produced official credentials along with a letter bearing the governor's signature. He handed both documents to Mercer without raising his voice. "The governor has personally confirmed Senator Brooks's schedule this morning. He was traveling to Richmond following a community breakfast exactly as planned." Mercer examined the documents carefully, though he already knew there was nothing left to question. The certainty that had guided him only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. Naomi Carter quietly collected the senator's briefcase from beside the booth, while Grace Collins finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. Several customers exchanged relieved smiles, but no one celebrated. The atmosphere still carried the weight of everything that had happened. Mercer looked toward Elijah with visible regret. "Senator Brooks," he began quietly, The words refused to come easily. Elijah gently interrupted before embarrassment could become humiliation. "Officer, take your time." That unexpected kindness only made the silence feel heavier. Mercer slowly removed the handcuffs with careful professionalism. The metallic click echoed softly through the diner before disappearing into complete stillness. Elijah calmly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. He did not glare at the officer. He did not demand an apology. Instead, he looked around the diner at the worried faces surrounding them. "I hope everyone finishes breakfast before it gets cold," he said with a faint smile. A few nervous laughs quietly spread through the room, easing a tension that had seemed impossible to break only moments earlier. Thomas Reynolds looked toward Mercer. "Officer, your department leadership has already been notified. Representatives from Internal Affairs are on their way to speak with you. Until they arrive, please remain available." Mercer nodded without argument. "Yes, sir." Through the front windows, another county vehicle entered the parking lot. Grace recognized the insignia immediately and understood that this morning was far from over. Elijah reached for his coffee cup, then smiled when he realized it had long since gone cold. Grace hurried over with a fresh pot. "This one is on the house," she said softly. Elijah smiled warmly. "No, Grace. I still believe in paying for breakfast." She shook her head with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Then let me consider it a thank you for reminding all of us what dignity really looks like." For the first time that morning, the quiet inside Rosie's diner no longer felt heavy. It felt thoughtful, as every person present realized they had witnessed something far greater than the end of a misunderstanding. They had witnessed the difference between possessing authority and deserving respect. Within minutes, another pair of vehicles from the county administration pulled quietly into the parking lot. Unlike the first arrivals, these officials wore simple business attire instead of uniforms, their expressions serious but composed. They entered Rosie's diner without fanfare, greeting Thomas Reynolds with brief handshakes before turning their attention toward Officer Daniel Mercer. The tallest of the group introduced herself in a calm, measured voice. "I am Linda Foster with the Office of Professional Standards. We have been directed to begin an administrative review immediately." Mercer acknowledged her with a silent nod. There was no argument left to make. The confidence that had carried him into the diner earlier that morning had been replaced by the unmistakable weight of reflection. Linda continued, "Officer Mercer, under department policy, I am instructing you to surrender your department identification, your patrol vehicle keys, and your official badge pending review." The words were spoken without anger, yet every person inside the diner understood their significance. Mercer slowly reached toward his uniform. One by one, he removed the symbols of the authority he had carried so confidently only an hour before. He placed the badge carefully into Linda's waiting evidence envelope before setting down his identification card and keys beside it. No applause followed. No one celebrated his humiliation. Instead, the room remained respectfully silent. Senator Elijah Brooks watched the scene unfold with thoughtful eyes. He understood better than most that accountability should never become entertainment. Grace Collins quietly poured another cup of coffee for an elderly veteran seated near the window. The man accepted it with trembling hands before softly saying, "I spent 30 years believing a badge represented fairness." Grace answered gently, "Maybe it still can, but only when the person wearing it remembers why it was given." Several customers nodded in quiet agreement. Naomi Carter stood beside Elijah, reviewing the schedule on her tablet before looking up. "Senator, we can still make the committee meeting if we leave within the next 15 minutes. Elijah smiled faintly. "Then we should not keep them waiting." Before leaving, however, he turned toward Linda Foster. "May I ask one favor?" Linda looked surprised. "Of course, Senator." Elijah glanced briefly toward Mercer, who remained standing alone near the entrance. "Please remember that accountability and dignity should always travel together. Correct mistakes firmly, but never forget that every public servant remains a human being capable of learning from them." Linda considered his words for a moment before nodding respectfully. "I will remember that." Mercer slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time that morning, he spoke without authority, without assumptions, and without distance. "Senator Brooks," he said quietly, "I cannot undo what happened here today." Elijah met his gaze with calm sincerity. "No, officer. None of us can change yesterday once it becomes today." Mercer lowered his head. "I am truly sorry." Elijah stepped forward and offered a gentle nod. "Then let today become the first page of a better tomorrow." The simple response left several people visibly emotional. Even Thomas Reynolds looked away for a brief moment, as though giving both men the privacy their conversation deserved. Outside, the autumn wind carried another wave of golden leaves across the sidewalk. Inside, Rosie's diner slowly returned to life. Plates were picked up again. Coffee cups were lifted once more. Conversations resumed quietly, though every voice seemed softer than before. The morning had begun with assumptions and uncertainty, but it was ending with something far more enduring. Everyone present had witnessed how quickly authority could disappear, yet how powerfully character could remain. As Senator Elijah Brooks prepared to leave, the quiet rhythm of Rosie's diner slowly returned. The smell of fresh coffee once again drifted through the room, and conversations cautiously resumed, but nobody spoke quite as loudly as they had before. Something about the morning had changed every person who witnessed it. Grace Collins walked toward the front door, carrying a neatly folded paper bag. "Your breakfast sandwich," she said with a warm smile. "You never had the chance to eat it." Elijah accepted the bag with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Grace. I promise next time I will finish my coffee while it is still hot." A few customers smiled, grateful that the kindness they had always known seemed untouched by everything that had happened. Outside, reporters had not yet arrived. There were no television cameras waiting on the sidewalk, no microphones searching for dramatic headlines. Thomas Reynolds quietly opened the rear door of the state sedan while Naomi Carter reviewed the afternoon schedule one final time. Before stepping outside, Elijah paused and turned back toward the people gathered inside the diner. "May I have just a moment?" he asked. Every conversation stopped again. The senator looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people from every table. "This morning was uncomfortable for everyone here," he began. "Some of you felt anger. Some felt sadness. Others may have felt powerless because you did not know what to do." His voice remained gentle, never accusing anyone. "I hope none of you leave believing that silence always means agreement. Sometimes people remain quiet because they are searching for courage. The important thing is what we choose to do once that courage arrives." The elderly veteran slowly stood from his seat. "Senator," he said, "I wish I had spoken sooner." Elijah smiled kindly. "You spoke when your conscience told you it was time. That matters." A young mother holding her daughter's hand stepped forward next. "My little girl asked me why everyone looked so afraid." Elijah knelt slightly so he could speak at the child's eye level. "Because sometimes grown-ups forget that respect should come before assumptions," he said softly. "But they can always remember again." The little girl nodded with innocent seriousness before giving him a shy smile. Grace quietly wiped another tear from her cheek. Even Thomas Reynolds appeared deeply moved by the exchange. At that moment, Naomi's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen before looking toward Elijah. "Governor Whitmore would like to speak with you whenever you have a moment." Elijah accepted the phone. "Good morning, Governor." Although no one could hear the voice on the other end, Elijah listened attentively before answering. "Thank you, Governor. I appreciate your concern, but I do not believe today should become about me. If anything good comes from this morning, let it be renewed trust between the public and those who wear the badge with honor." He paused again, smiling faintly. "Yes, I would be honored to help with that effort." After ending the call, he handed the phone back to Naomi. "The governor plans to meet with community leaders and law enforcement next week," Naomi explained quietly. Elijah nodded. "Then perhaps today can become the beginning of a better conversation instead of another divided headline." As he stepped through the doorway, the cool autumn sunlight settled across the sidewalk. Behind him, the bell above the entrance rang one last time. Inside Rosie's diner, people slowly returned to their meals, but every person carried away the same unforgettable lesson. Respect given freely has the power to heal far more than authority imposed through fear ever can. The state's sedan disappeared down Main Street, leaving Rosie's diner exactly where it had always been, yet somehow different from the place it had been only a few hours earlier. The breakfast crowd slowly drifted away, carrying with them more than full stomachs. They carried a memory that would remain long after the coffee stains were wiped from the tables and the chairs were pushed neatly back beneath them. Grace Collins stood by the front window for a moment before returning to the counter. She picked up the cold coffee cup Elijah Brooks had left behind and smiled quietly to herself. "He still forgot to finish his coffee," she whispered. One of the younger waitresses laughed softly. "I do not think anyone will ever forget this morning." Grace gently rinsed the cup beneath warm water. Neither should they. Outside, Officer Daniel Mercer remained seated alone on a nearby bench, while representatives from his department completed their paperwork inside one of the county vehicles. For the first time in many years, he had nowhere to rush and no authority to exercise. The silence around him forced him to replay every decision he had made since walking into the diner. He remembered the assumptions he had accepted without question. He remembered every opportunity he had been given to stop, to listen, and to reconsider. Most of all, he remembered the calm voice of the man he had misjudged, a voice that never answered disrespect with bitterness. Later that afternoon, Governor Michael Whitmore released a brief public statement. It did not focus on punishment or politics. Instead, it reaffirmed that public trust depended on fairness, accountability, and equal treatment under the law. He also announced a statewide initiative expanding professional training focused on respectful public service, community relationships, and responsible decision-making. Senator Elijah Brooks declined every request to hold a press conference about the incident. When reporters finally reached him outside the Capitol building, he answered only one question. "Senator, after everything that happened this morning, what message do you hope people remember?" Elijah paused for a moment before looking across the crowd gathered outside the historic building. "I hope people remember that justice is strongest when it protects the dignity of every person," he said quietly. "If we only treat people fairly after discovering their title, their profession, or their influence, then we have misunderstood fairness completely. Character should never depend upon recognition." His answer spread quickly across television broadcasts, newspapers, and community meetings throughout the state. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Police supervisors shared it during morning briefings. Parents repeated it around dinner tables. In Asheford, Rosie's diner became known not because something extraordinary had happened there, but because ordinary people had witnessed the extraordinary power of patience, truth, and grace. Months later, Grace placed a small framed quotation near the cash register where every customer could see it before leaving. It was not signed with anyone's name. It simply read, "Respect given only to the important is not respect at all. Real character is revealed by how we treat those we believe owe us nothing." Customers often stopped to read it before walking outside. Some smiled. Others stood quietly for a moment, reflecting on their own choices. And somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the official reports, and beyond the conversations that slowly faded with time, one lesson continued to echo. A badge may grant authority, a title may command attention, and power may influence a room, but none of those things define the measure of a human being. In the end, the strongest voice inside Rosie's diner was never the loudest one. It was the quiet truth that refused to disappear. Because authority can make people obey for a moment, but only justice rooted in dignity can earn respect that lasts for generations.